Assalamualaikum and greetings everyone. Welcome to the 13th Academy of Sciences Malaysia General Assembly. I am Nazmi, your MC for today. On behalf of the Academy of Sciences Malaysia, I would like to wish everyone a good morning and thank you for joining us via Zoom, Facebook Live, and YouTube. I hope you are safe and healthy wherever you may be. Today, we are honored to have our distinguished guests gracing the program. We have Professor Dr. Asma Ismail, President of the Academy of Sciences Malaysia, Academician Emeritus Professor Tan Sri Dato Sri Dr. Zakri Abdul Hamid, Chairman of ATRI Advisory, Ambassador and Science Advisor of the Global Campaign for Nature. We also have our specialists in attendance today. We have Professor Dr. Denison Jayasuriya, Principal Research Fellow at KITA Secretariat, Head of All Party Parliamentary Group Malaysia, APPGM, SDG. Ms. Lakshmi Lavanya, Head of Policy and Climate Change from the World Wildlife Fund. Distinguished Professor of Economics, Dr. Raja Rasya from University Malaya Asia Europe Institute. And Ms. Tan Mei Ling, Senior Country Operations Officer from the World Bank. Ladies and gentlemen, the 13th ASM General Assembly today carries the theme Humanizing the Economy through People, Planet, Prosperity, Peace, and Partnerships of SDGs for Greater Impact. The year 2020 was an extraordinary time in human history. The United Nations reported that the COVID-19 pandemic has had a huge impact in several areas, undermining decades of development efforts. Essentially, the pandemic has signaled that it is high time to place emphasis on humanizing the economy, creating a framework that emphasizes equality, cooperation, and social impact within the SDGs. The specialists present today will be talking about how the 5 Ps, people, planet, prosperity, peace, and partnerships should take center stage as the basis for building a humanized economy. But first, please join me in welcoming the President of Academy of Sciences Malaysia, Professor Dr. Asma Ismail, to deliver her welcoming remarks.
Okay, thank you very much, Nazmi. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Salam sejahtera and a very good morning to all. Our esteemed senior fellows and fellows of the Academy of Sciences Malaysia, distinguished moderator, academician emeritus Professor Tan Sri Dr. Zakri Abdul Hamid, our esteemed panelists, Professor Dr. Denison Jayasuriya, Ms. Lakshmi Lavanya Rama Iyer, distinguished Professor Dr. Rajah Rasya, Ms. Tan and Ms. Tan Mei Ling. And also morning to Puan Hazami Habib, the ASM Chief Executive Officer, ladies and gentlemen. Warmest greetings from the Academy of Sciences Malaysia. Basically, it is my pleasure to welcome all of you to the 13th General Assembly. The last GA was in 2019, just before the MCO. And little did we realize that that was the last face-to-face meeting that we had. We did not have a GA in 2020, only the AGM, which was for the first time done online. And since then, we've been doing all our meetings and seminars online. And today will be the first General Assembly that is also done online. Now, the General Assembly was initiated by ASM in 2012 as a platform for fellows and stakeholders to basically discuss multidisciplinary STI issues of national importance. The intellectual discourse over the years has mooted many studies and initiatives being undertaken by ASM. And since its establishment in 1995, ASM has become the platform for the pursuit of excellence in science, engineering, and technology for the benefit of all. And a wide spectrum of strategic STI studies and programs have been undertaken to drive and deliver value in the form of independent, credible, and timely scientific advice and advocacy. And the last GA, ladies and gentlemen, was on hydrogen economy. It was so interesting that we had formed a study on it, led by Professor Datuk Wan Ramli, and the study is now being considered by EPU for RMK12. So such is the impact of our GA. So these initiatives were made possible by basically leveraging on some of the greatest scientific minds of our nation within the academy, together with many other prominent international and local partners. So this morning is our honor to have the distinguished moderator and panelists who have agreed to share with us their insights and views on humanizing the economy through people, planet, prosperity, peace, and partnerships of SDGs for greater impact. So with academician Tan Sri Zakri as the moderator, I basically foresee an interesting and insightful discussion today. We also look forward to the deliberations and discussions by our esteemed panelists for People and Peace. We have Professor Datuk Dr. Denison Jayasuriya, Honorary Professor at KITA and Secretariat Head of APPGM SDG. Correct, the right person to now have as a panelist. We also have Ms. Lakshmi Lavanya Rama Iyer, the Head of Policy and Climate Change, WWF, covering for Planet. Distinguished Professor Datuk Dr. Raja Rasya, our own fellow covering prosperity, and Ms. Tan Mei Ling, the World Bank Senior Country Operations Officer, that will now elaborate on partnerships. So I hope that the deliberations today will be an eye-opener, just like the last GA on hydrogen economy, and that at the end of it, we can all come up with some practical recommendations and formulate targeted strategies in relation to today's important yet timely topic. Ladies and gentlemen, as we know, Malaysia, together with 192 world leaders, had adopted the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development at the United Nations General Assembly in New York on the 25th of September 2015. And this is a global commitment towards a more sustainable, resilient, and inclusive development with 17 Sustainable Development Goals and 169 targets. Now, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development serves as a collective blueprint to achieve a better and more sustainable future for all. Now, SDGs recognize that ending poverty must go hand in hand with strategies that will build economic growth and addresses a range of social needs, including education, health, social protection, and job opportunities, while tackling climate change and environmental protection. So it challenges governments around the world basically to get serious about delivering an integrated and balanced social, economic, environmental agenda. So in short, science provides the evidence, but the science advice given to the government must be human-centric and balanced with values. Now, Malaysia's 5-year National Development Plan has always been geared towards addressing the economic, the social, and environmental agenda. And in the recent plans, more emphasis has been placed on alignment with SDGs. Now, the Economic Planning Unit, or EPU's integration of initiatives and outcomes of Malaysia plans, to target to the targets and indicators of SDG has been done through relevant mapping exercise. And this, I think, is a right step. Is a step in the right direction that EPU is now taking stance. So in the coming years, we hope that the national policies and plans will effectively address the 3 developmental dimensions of economic empowerment, environmental sustainability, and social re-engineering to basically achieve the shared prosperity vision of 2030. Now, although Malaysia's voluntary national review 2017 showed significant progress towards achieving the SDG, the COVID-19 pandemic definitely has reset some of these records. Yeah? A survey by the Department of Statistics Malaysia showed that in 2020, 20% of our household from the M40 group with an income between 4,850 to 10,959 have now moved down to the B40 group. Now, although percentage of individuals using internet in 2019 has increased with 87.5% in the urban areas, we have 72.7% in the rural areas, we still have connectivity issues, a challenge basically now for online learning. Malaysia also has a high number of women in higher learning institutions and organizations that is taking on leadership roles. However, with the pandemic setting in, we are now witnessing more women choosing to leave their jobs in order to take care of the children and elderly. So these are among many challenges, ladies and gentlemen, before us that need solution. As most of our SDG status has regressed, it's time, I guess, to reassess where we are and strategize recovery plans to put us back on track in the pursuit of the 17 SDGs. Now, ladies and gentlemen, to basically support and ensure balanced initiatives and programs being developed by the government and private sector, the Academy had developed the 10-10 Malaysia Science, Technology, Innovation and Economy Framework, or what we call MySTIE, that was adopted now by the National Science Council in July 2020 and was later launched by the YB Minister of MOSTI, KJ at that time, together with the National Science, Technology, Innovation Policy of 2021 to 2030, and both was launched on the 8th of December in 2020. Now, to address the socio-economic disparities for sustainable national development, the framework basically provides a systematic approach to transform Malaysia into a knowledge-intensive economy, not by chance, but this time by design. And this allows for focused, impactful, and inclusive development, focusing on 30 national STIE niche areas towards ensuring wealth creation and societal well-being. All national policies, initiatives, research and development programs should mainstream STI knowledge and mission-oriented innovation in order to transform our nation to be a well-balanced and developed nation by 2030, aligned with the shared prosperity of 2030 and the SDGs. Now, to date, ASM has had 125 engagements, and this engagement is increasing by the day with the various stakeholders from the government ministries, from the agencies and state governments and scientific communities, both the researchers and academia, with industry players and corporate bodies, as well as STI professional bodies and civil society organizations spanning over 80 organizations. Now, the 10-10 MySTIE framework has been spotlighted by the UK government's Office of Science Study on features of effective systemic foresight in governments around the world. And this study was released recently in 2021. For your information, ladies and gentlemen, Malaysia is the only developing country among the 8 countries showcased as a case study on best practices related to foresighting, which is like futures thinking and future focus. And specifically, the report specifically mentioned the 10-10 MySTIE framework developed by the Academy of Sciences Malaysia as the framework that uses, to quote the report, whole of government and society approach to ensure that science, technology, innovation, and economic development policies and plans enhance economic growth, improve the livelihood as well as quality of life of the citizens and global competitiveness of Malaysia as outlined in the National Shared Prosperity Vision 2030. Now, ladies and gentlemen, if this framework is rightly implemented, it will enable key sectors of the economy to become more knowledge intensive and innovation driven. This will enhance the competitiveness and sustainability of Malaysian industries. But it is also designed to actually enhance the quality of life of the rakyat with not only return of investment, but also with return of values. Now, ASM will continue to provide strategic inputs to the government on areas of national importance based on planetary health approaches to address the 5 key areas of safety, security, safeguards, seamless integration, and sustainability. Thus, a discussion like what we're about to have today will tell us the new forces of change that will enable ASM to basically identify human-centric approaches and participatory models of engagement for shared responsibility, collective action, and positive impact. After all, ladies and gentlemen, science is not to serve the scientists, but for scientists to serve humanity. So ladies and gentlemen, I look forward to an engaging session, and I hope that our partnership in today's gathering can be a small contribution towards creating a sustainable future. Before I conclude, let me express my thanks to Puan Hazami and the entire ASM management team for working tirelessly to make this event possible. I would also like to take this opportunity to invite all of you to the launching of the Science Outlook 2020, scheduled on the 7th of October 2021. Please mark the date in your diary. We have invited our new Minister of MOSTI, Datuk Sri Adam Baba, Dr. Adam Baba, to launch the book, and I certainly look forward to again see you virtually for this event. So ladies and gentlemen, I leave you with a teaser video to give you a glimpse of the Science Outlook of 2020. So thank you very much and stay safe. Sekian wabillahi taufiq wa hidayah. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Ladies and gentlemen, let us proceed to the main event of today's program. Viewers, you may submit your questions regarding today's topic in the Zoom chat and Facebook and YouTube comment section. For this session, I would like to invite our honored moderator, Academician Emeritus Professor Tan Sri Dato Sri Dr. Zakri Abdul Hamid. Tan Sri Zakri is currently the chairman of ATRI Advisory. He also spearheads the WIS Foundation and National Geographic's Campaign for Nature 30 by 30 initiative in the ASEAN region. Tan Sri Zakri, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you, Nazmi. Assalamualaikum and a very good morning to all the participants. At the outset, let me recognize Professor Dato Asma, President of the Academy of Sciences Malaysia, the Vice President Dato Bakar Jaafar, the Secretary General Dato Awang, my distinguished panelists, ladies and gentlemen. Can I have the first slide, please? Ladies and gentlemen, what we are going to discuss this morning is a very interesting one. It's about how science relate to the outside world. I got involved in this so-called science policy interface by accident. In fact, 30 years ago, I was co-opted as a junior member of the Malaysian delegation negotiating the UN Biodiversity Treaty, 35 years ago to be exact. So at the end of the first day of the negotiation, I plucked courage to meet my head of delegation, and I told her, the ambassador, I said, Madam, I think I wanted to go home. She looked at me quite amused, quite upset. She said, why? because I said, I come from the university, and what they're doing here, the diplomats, the delegation met in plenary for 20 to 25 minutes, and then they adjourned to the delegates lounge, have coffee and have a chit chat. She looked at me and she told me, Professor Zachary, why don't you give yourself a few more days? So ladies and gentlemen, that was 35 years ago, because I then found out it was in the delegates lounge where horses were traded, where agreements were made. And when they adjourned to the plenary again for half an hour or so, it's only to formalize the issue at hand. So there you are. When we talk about these global challenges, that's what it is. Next slide, please. Some scientists are saying that we are now facing the sixth mass extinction, where human beings have existed for just 200,000 years, yet our impact on the planet is so great that scientists around the world are calling for our period in the Earth history to be named the Anthropocene, the age of humans. So the changes we are now making have exacted a heavy toll on the natural world around us. Next slide, please. This is the famous Shibuya crossing in downtown Tokyo, where you see thousands of people crossing on the street. 200 years ago, there were less than 1 billion people on Earth. Today, there are about, 7.8 billion, and our population is still growing. According to the United Nations, unless we take action, there is likely to be more 30% of us by 2050 and 11 billion people by 2100. Wow. Every one of us places demands upon our planet, the very demands that have caused the changes that threatens us and the natural world we depend on. So this is, next slide please, this is the background of the sixth mass extinction, where species are becoming more extinct and our ecosystem services are being degraded. Next slide. So, ladies and gentlemen, the world has not been sitting still. They have taken action. In fact, as early as 1987, Madam Brundtland, the Norwegian Prime Minister, chaired the select committee to work out what is the problem, and they came out with this publication, Our Common Future, which also introduced the term sustainable development, which I don't need to define to all of you today. Fast track to this year, 2021, a very interesting year because I think in November, the climate change meeting, COP26, will be meeting in Glasgow, and in October, the biodiversity meeting, COP15, will be meeting in Kunming. They are going to debate a lot of the issues that we are going to discuss today. Next slide. And Dr. Asman mentioned that the concern of the world have been embodied in the SDGs, the 17 SDGs agreed by world leaders in 2015. And 5 years or 6 years down the road, this year, we are making a lot of progress, but the progress has been not so rapid. But these SDGs also embodies the 5 Ps that we are going to discuss today.
Recording in progress.
Let's go to the next slide. Next slide, please. Yes. So these are the things that we're going to discuss. Let me just plunge in now to the panelists. We have a very distinguished panelists of Malaysians today who are in the fray of all the issues that we listed here. Let me go straight to the first speaker, Professor Dato Dennison Jayasuriya of UKM needs no introduction. He is the 2017 UN award laureate in Malaysia. But what is also interesting about Dr. Dennison, he is currently head of secretariat for the all-party parliamentary group Malaysia on SDGs. I want to come back to this because eventually I think one of the conclusion we need to make is how academia or the ASM can connect with this powerful group in parliament. So with that, Dato, I give you 5 minutes to speak on people because you'll come back to speak on the other aspect here on the piece. But for now, Prof, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Tan Sri, for your kind words of introduction, and thank you to Professor Asma and the Academy of Science for placing this theme of SDGs at the heart of not just scientific work, but also academic rigor, evidence-based, to further strengthen the development agenda that will come in the 12th plan. People are actually at the heart of development. And in the SDGs, the focal theme or the ultimate output or outcome, as you might want to say it, is leaving no one behind. Leaving no one behind. So no one here refers to every human being, at least in the context of people. Now, in SDG 10.2, there are 9 categories of people that have been highlighted in that document that is then significant. By 2030, empower and promote socio-economic and political inclusion of all, irrespective of age, intergenerational, sex, which is gender, disability, race, ethnicity, origin, religion, or economic or other status. Could be caste, class, and so forth. 9 different categories where inclusion is at the heart of this, where people who are the most vulnerable then need to be treated with dignity, rights as human beings. There are global indicators of the trends as well as national and its impact, which we can discuss later. But the SDG document itself brings out some of the key root causes of poverty that needs to be addressed through systematic intervention, structural as well as personal and so forth. Poverty, lack of social protection, inequality, discrimination, unequal access to services, unequal access to justice, land rights, unequal access to participation, especially women, indigenous groups, no documentation, land is central with indigenous people, decent jobs and unemployment. So there's a whole area that needs to be addressed and not just a singular focus on poverty, but interrelated. Now, in terms of the way forward is that it needs to be not from a handout approach, but actually empowerment, a shift to social and community economic models, people having a say in development, a focus in capacity and capability development, a much stronger application to multidimensional poverty, which was in the 11th plan and midterm review, but a revisit because the dimensions are correct: education, health, living conditions, income, but the indicators are not. And government doesn't use the multidimensional poverty as a checklist for delivery, while the data is collected in e-Kase and so forth. So we see the magnitude of this, how poverty is interrelated. And when I take up peace and so forth, even governance is interrelated in this context. So linking injustice, unequal access, and that certain sections are more vulnerable, especially women, single mothers, disabled people, interior forest-based communities, very rural community, the new poor in the urban context, and so forth. And that needs the focus and, of course, the link to social protection and other more formal areas. So people at the heart. If people are not there, nothing will move. People themselves are the object, but also the process. Thank you very much, Tan Sri.
Thank you very much, Prof, for that very concise exposition. I now move on to my next colleague, Ms. Lavanya Ramaiah, representing the WWF Malaysia on various national and international levels on climate change, biodiversity loss, and the SDGs. Ms. Lavanya, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Tan Sri Zakri, and thank you so much to ASM. Thank you, Dato' Asma, for this opportunity, for inviting WWF to be part of this very important forum today, and for inviting me to be talking on this important pillar, planet of the SDGs. Now, I think Tan Sri Zakri earlier gave an excellent expo of the historical developments relating especially to the environmental movement and his own personal experience in it. So we are really very honored to have Tan Sri moderating this session. But in that note, let's start with some good news actually. So yesterday, 8 September 2021, could be marked as a green day in our history books. Not one, but two decisions went in support of nature and the environment. We have all been hearing about the degazettement of precious peat swamp forests in Kuala Langat, called the Kuala Langat North Forest Reserve, where Orang Asli communities rely on for their livelihoods to make way for mixed development in inverted commas, as it was called. There was a huge public outcry with strong civil society organization support, and we heard the good news yesterday that the area would be regazetted back into a forest reserve, and the replacement area that was also identified would continue to be kept as gazetted forest reserve. Another win was the Penang South Island Reclamation EIA appeal. Dato' Asma, you would probably be very familiar with it coming from Penang. The appellate body found in favor of the appellants, the fisherfolk of the area, who stood to lose their livelihoods, amongst other things. The EIA approval was hence overturned yesterday. Again, there was a massive public outcry when the extent of the project and its dire impacts came to light, and a novel approach under the EQA by lawyer and environmental activist Meena Raman was undertaken along with the fisherfolk to challenge the EIA decision. But in the backdrop to this, we have also been witnessing severe impacts on people, lives, and livelihoods due to climate-related natural disasters. Two recent examples: the tragic incident in Gunung Jerai, Kedah, where lives were lost and homes washed away, infrastructure also damaged. A sum of 78 million has been allocated by the federal government for infrastructure repair and to compensate people who were affected. I'd just like to compare this to the budget allocation of 70 million last year that was allocated for ecological fiscal transfer. You see the difference. One incident can, use up that entire amount and even more just to rehabilitate. Likewise, unusual rains in Sabah caused flooding that also resulted in loss of lives and damage to property. You see, and no one was spared. At one point, flooding also affected the former CM, Syed Kruak's house. So everybody is impacted by these effects. And if we zoom out, these phenomena are occurring in other parts of the world too. Unprecedented floods in New York, Germany, dust storms in China, wildfires in Greece, and the list goes on. So the UN came out with a dire call last month in its latest climate change scientific report, declaring a code red for humanity, and made clear the extent to which human activity is responsible for climate change and its already devastating effects. We are on the brink of an existential crisis with a very small window of opportunity to remain within the temperature envelope science has determined as feasible to avert the worst impacts. All this clearly shows how intricately human well-being is linked to planetary health. And it was great to hear earlier this year, the My Climate Action Council, which was formed recently, and which I believe Tan Sri Zakri, you're an advisor of, to announce that planetary health would be one of the things that we would be taking into account in decision-making moving forward. Due to our activities, we have caused an imbalance to the entire planetary system. We have, as Tan Sri mentioned earlier, entered the age of the Anthropocene, where man's actions has a profound impact on the entire planetary system. And apart from climate change, which many of us know about, an equally dire but less well-known impact, which is also destabilizing the planetary system, is the unprecedented loss of biodiversity. Again, Tan Sri, you were the first chair of IPBES, so you are very familiar with this. We are intricately linked to all the other species we share this one home, our planet Earth, with. Yet, again, caused by, I am sorry if you are hearing the dogs barking in the background, yet again, caused by man's actions and greed, I would say, species population sizes have declined by almost 70% since 1970. No doubt, you would have also heard about the World Economic Forum, which for more than 5 years now has found environmental causes due to climate change and biodiversity loss as the top risks for businesses, both in terms of impact and livelihood. So in short, people and economy are both at risk of even more severe and possibly irreversible damage if we don't seize the opportunity to rectify this now. The IPCC climate report says there is a small window of opportunity for societies to switch to more sustainable practices, with focus shifting from economic growth to overall well-being. The report calls for shifting to protecting well-being rather than pursuing limitless growth as the pathway most able to deliver this narrow band of opportunity. So what can we do? How can the scientific community especially contribute to make the changes we need at societal and policy-making level? As a mega biodiverse country, Malaysia has a huge potential to be a leader in shaping the global path to healing the world and our futures. In this regard, let me outline 4 things that we can advance. First is to make a concerted effort towards drastically reducing our greenhouse gas emissions to net zero and seize the opportunities to improve economy and livelihoods that a long-term transition of this scale offers in a systematic manner. To support this effort, society at large have already started having conversations and studies. One of this, I am pleased to say, is a study by WWF Malaysia in collaboration with BCG on net zero emissions pathways for Malaysia, which is currently underway. It's an independent study engaging a wide range of stakeholders, and we hope to engage with ASM too. We hope to contribute to Malaysia setting ambitious policy goals which can serve as the Northern Star for collective action in the spirit of taking an all-of-nation approach to addressing this challenge. In undertaking the study, it is apparent that nature plays an integral and critical role. Our forests, for example, provide tremendous services in capturing about almost 70% of total emissions in 2014. So we need to continuously value and factor in nature into decision-making, something which has been ignored to date, sad to say. Hence, the decisions that brought about the public outcry I referred to earlier. And as we speak, the development of Federal Hill in Klang Valley in the heart of the city is causing great concern to the residents of Bangsa and the wider Klang Valley. So the second thing we need to focus on is to integrate nature into policy and decision-making. For the corporate sector, we are seeing ESG approaches becoming increasingly important to adopt sustainability into business blueprints. Several companies have announced net zero targets, and in addition, the financial sector led by Bank Negara and Securities Commission has also adopted a taxonomy on assessing climate risks in line with the Task Force on Climate-Related Disclosures requirement. The corollary to this is coming up soon for nature, the TNFD, has now been established, and the scientific community can certainly help the corporate sector in assessing business risks from both climate change and loss of nature. Malaysia has also been in the forefront of moving financial decisions in the Islamic finance space to a more humane approach by adopting the value-based intermediation, which defines value beyond profit making to include impact on society and the environment. And these efforts will certainly advance taking a more holistic approach to, say, city planning or even measuring national progress. But we need tools for this. And this brings me to my last 2 points. The donut economy model. My third point is a way of ensuring that society operates within the safe operating space of planetary boundaries whilst meeting the fundamental needs of society. So the decision-making process is shifted from growth to impacts on society as the fundamental goal. Scientific input into understanding the boundaries to maintain planetary health while providing for societal needs will be critical. And this then feeds into the need to have a fundamental shift in progress measurement, my fourth and final point. Advancement in this has been recently announced to shift from GDP to GEP, gross ecological product calculation. Science has contributed to this through the use of technology in valuing nature's contribution to economic and social well-being. A tool called INVEST has been developed to value natural capital, and this has been successfully used in China to identify 50% of its land area, which needs to be rehabilitated and protected in line with its ecological society aspiration. And the UN too recently adopted the gross ecological product, or GEP, and sees this as a useful tool to advance international negotiations on climate change, biological diversity, as well as meeting the SDGs. I would like to therefore end by calling for ASM to spearhead this for Malaysia by bringing the necessary scientific and technological inputs required for policymakers and the corporates to advance in integrating nature into all our actions. Thank you.
Thank you, Lavanya, for your very perceptive observation and some of those good news that you mentioned, which we are going to come back during the discussion part. Let me proceed with the third speaker on prosperity, distinguished Professor Dato' Raja Ratsaya, my former colleague at UKM in our younger days, and he went on to the University of Malaya. Raja has been an expert on the conceptualization of technology to development. He is well sought after nationally and internationally to provide advice on these areas. So, Professor Ulong, you have the floor.
Thank you, Humphrey, whom I regard as my global champion on biodiversity. And of course, thank you to Dato' Asma for giving me the opportunity to speak today, as well as to ASM. Shall I share the screen? I'm sure Humphrey would not be as generous to me with time, so let me just keep myself without having to go through all the slides. Instead of taking on the position of the UN and clarifying what the UN is out to do with the 17 SDGs, I just wanted to emphasize 2 points here, and perhaps the ASM will take it on subsequently. One of which is the way we define intellectual property rights, so that we don't define it the same way with every goods and services, so that public goods and public utilities are accessible to the masses. If we're dealing with the SDGs, and if we think equality is an important point, if we think climate change need to be stopped, global warming need to be mitigated, if we think that the society as a whole should live in harmony, so that whoever they are, wherever they are located, they should not be harmed. I think it's important that goods and services have different ways of defining, so that profits don't dominate appropriation, take up of patents, for example. Likewise, I would also mention a point which is largely for Malaysia and countries like Malaysia who are somewhat stuck in the middle income track, largely because, not because we don't have the infrastructure. We have lots of it since 1991, at least. We built all sorts of intermediary organizations, physically as well, as an ecosystem to support innovation in firms, but it's not really happening so much, which explains why our value added as a whole hasn't really grown sufficiently for us to catch up, even with Taiwan and Korea. Now, I would also mention another important point that relates to the quadruple helix, except that the quadruple helix, while it's got the 4 corners of it, somewhat misdefined in Malaysia, because the civil society in Malaysia is represented by, not by, say, Ms. Lakshmi Lavanya's outfit or organizations like that, civil society or Mina Raman, but more by FMM. That's not how the Swedish defined the 4th corner of the helix. Industry, government, university, and civil society. We should get them into the fold and to see how they participate in shaping what should influence the allocation of resources. I think that's important. But here I'm talking about open innovation. How do you incorporate open innovation in ways where the appropriation, not just the creation, but also the appropriation of it is well done. I think this is just the structure of the organizations, I think, that are important in terms of how knowledge is created, appropriated, and so on. What is important here is knowledge is a public good. I will explain later. Can we move the next change, please? These are the 4 pillars, I think, that are critical in transforming an underdeveloped location. Apart from absorbing the sustainable development elements that the UN promoted, although of course I'd like to see them only in 6 categories rather than the 17 they put up there. My feeling is this is the way to transform, rather than using the Potterian approach and so on, because that's really something that worked on developed locations. And here I've got a reference that you can look at in the 5 minutes. I can't carry that. If there are questions, you can come back to that. Can we go to the next slide, please? Yeah, this is something I've begun emphasizing extensively on, apart from the nature to the need to get into biotech. It's the digital infrastructure and how it connects with Industry 4.0 to synergize R&D and innovations in such a way that you create knowledge networks where small firms, small farmers can connect with public labs, can connect with incubators in science parks to appropriate knowledge in ways that are beneficial for both. In the case of research, and I've seen this happen, say, in Puerto Montt when I did this project for UNIDO in Chile, how scientists fly from Universidad de Chile, go right down to Puerto Montt and help those guys who are involved in the farming of salmon, and including dealing with diseases there. Now, it also, and in a way, we have smart schools in Malaysia. I think it launched in 1999, way earlier than Korea and Taiwan, 2012 and 2014. But they have appropriated a lot more synergy than what we have done, simply because they're enabling them to connect with all these knowledge nodes, not just simply physically offering them computers and connecting them with internet. It's the underlying nature of that is to enable and open up minds to their mental faculties. And that's happening there. And I don't see it really happening here. These are things that need to be done. Now, what is here important is, one, if it's understood quite well, then the government should not just launch projects that deal with whether firms are ready, whether people are ready. That should be a phase in the process of looking at what should happen. You should, just like foresight exercises that the ASM did, what should happen should be there. And it is that idea, stylized framework of the future that should be the objective. And the readiness study should just be a starting point. And so I don't see these things happening so much. And I've been also advising Muhammad Ali Jinnah University in Karachi. And I've been telling that if you bring it to the small guy, he will understand. If you are going to wait for him to see if he's ready, you will never get to them. So I think these are things, these junctures that needs some sort of solving. But what's also important is, unlike, say, the earlier era, what we see now is the creation of opportunities for the appropriation of scope economies in parallel with scale economies. In the past, you either have scale or scope, which means to say you can have a diversification, a whole range of things. Small guys do that, but they can't appropriate scale economies. And if you have large scale production, like say Henry Ford conveyor belt, that what Honda does, for example, you mass produce something. Now you can have all of them together, appropriate synergies both ways. You can mass customize on the same platform. That's what IR 4.0 has offered. And I haven't got the time to go beyond this, but I think the Smart School initiative should be built on. Next slide, please. This is something I wanted to explain before I go to my last slide. When it comes to a public good, it's not the same as public utility, because once created, like knowledge or even climate change, they are all public goods. In fact, that's the global common, as Garrett Hardin put it, in the tragedy of commons. A lot of this knowledge is not defined by money. A lot of this knowledge seeps through. Even if you attempt to define them as patents, somehow you cannot preclude every one of them. Once created, it's non-excludable and non-rivalrous, which means to say the cost is already borne. The more and more people use it'll be much more economic, much more efficient. It would reach the entire society. So those kinds of areas require special governance, and that attracts, say, grants and so on. But once we give grants, you must make sure that there is appropriation, there's some sort of effects there. Malaysia is good at giving grants and incentives, but not really good to connect that with a roadmap that specifically defines targets to be met. Now, we are good in one sense because the governance body talks about publication. So we have really turned up lots of publications in the UNESCO reports that I've done. Yes, very successful, but we haven't really appropriated as much patents and its conversion to commercializable goods and services. And again, here, I'm not just talking about what firms buy, but what society as a whole would require. And that would actually have a different notion of how property rights should be defined. Last slide, please. Yes. Having explained the key points of a proactive technological regime, which is what I was talking about here, to promote sustainable development with technical progress, the following recommendations should be appropriate to promote social and economic synergies effectively. I use the term social as well, rather than an economist. Some people try to call me a mainstream economist. I would say nonsense, because I'm often a critique of mainstream economics. Potential and promotion of R&D inclusive of IR 4.0 technologies need emphasis on adaptive innovations to absorb the transformation essential to usher in the takeover by IR 4.0 technologies. There's a whole lot of technologies that come from root technologies. The question of how do we spin off those things? I think the incubator should play a critical role there. The transition to a quadruple helix framework with the critical pillars of industry, university, government, and civil society, but the need to absorb open innovation principles is important because of the fact that there's a distinction between private and public goods. And in here, knowledge is a public good, security is a public good, the environment is a public good, but not water, not healthcare, because you exclude them if you don't produce enough hospital beds and so on. But it must reach everyone. So there need to be some sort of governance to make sure that you don't have a private side taking over such public goods and such public utilities. Next one, please. As is seen now with a mad scramble by the biopharma businesses and governments struggling to obtain COVID-19 vaccines to vaccinate all members of society, it is pertinent that the UN, These are things the sustainable development agenda hasn't really extended sufficiently well, define those things. Seek alternative funding to support public ownership of patents associated with essential goods and services such as the COVID-19 vaccines. As public utilities must reach all members of society, attempts to exclude them from the pool should be discouraged. There's a way the moratoriums involving AIDS, for example, has evolved, allowing generic drugs. But of course, that same thing is being discussed here, but that again, to me, is not sufficient. Where R&D and innovations are involved, including patents and design, the promotion of public and utilities must emphasize the open innovation framework. But apart from the significant international collaboration, remember how our double cropping and so on came. We basically imported the genes from IRI, International Rice Research Institute, adapted, and all of a sudden you see during Tundra time, enormous increase in productivity and so on. You don't need rocket science to do this. So the understanding of society becomes critical. The final point I like to make here, which it doesn't seem to be here, Malaysia's problem is a lack of evaluation, monitoring, appraisal. We've spent huge amounts of money, but why haven't they translated into rising, say, commercialization, like the Swedish framework, the Vinnova model has brought, or the Taiwanese case, or the Route 128 in the US. Now, if we have clearly defined this thing, which Park Chung-hee did, in order to make sure that there was always result that rents are not being dissipated, we need to be very stern on those things. Thank you. I'm done, Professor Tan Sri.
Thank you. Thank you, Raja. Very good. In fact, your last point is so relevant. Malaysia, we churn out a lot of R&D money, but we lack the follow-up to monitor and evaluate. We'll come back to that issue, Raja. I want to invite back Dato' Dennison to speak on peace before giving the floor to Ms. Tan. Dato' Dennison.
Thank you, Tan Sri, for this second opportunity to share using my 5 minutes. I see sometimes you are a bit generous. I'll see. But thank you for this opportunity. I think in the context normally of development planning and so forth, economic, social, environment, the aspect of peace, justice, strong institutions is normally not integrated. But what the SDGs have done through SDG 16 is actually bring governance into the heart of this. Not just governance, but unity, social cohesion, peace. There won't be prosperity if there is conflict, insecurity, and so forth. So fundamentally linking development agenda with fundamental freedoms. And I think Amartya Sen's work on development of freedom and interlinking this is quite central. In the Malaysian VNR report 2017, this was not addressed. And in 2021 VNR report, while it was highlighted, I think Malaysia was actually quite weak in the scorecards by international civil society assessment of Malaysia's performance in this context. I think it's important for us to bring the issues of peace, justice, strong institutions into the kind of things that we are talking of, whether it is environmental justice or economic developments, the evaluation, monitoring, and so forth, because politics, decision-making, and governance is central. In the SDGs, sorry, I'm going back to the document because it sets the framework for the SDGs. There is a call for equal access to justice, SDG 16.3, or in SDG 16.5 on corruption and bribery. So central to development and other things is the independent institutions addressing corruption and bribery and stamping that out in society for not just trust building, but foreign investment, domestic investments, and so forth. Also in SDG 16, 6 and 7, people's participation, accountable institutions, and SDG 16 brings non-discrimination. I feel we have three major challenges in this context. While we might have been successful better in poverty, health, education, and areas. First is the political capture. Politics and the executive control on institutional governance, courts, parliament, anti-corruption agencies, human rights that become subservient to the executive, the separation of powers, and this might sound political, but fundamental to development, this is at crisis. Second, non-compliance to international standards when it comes to these areas of building public trust, public confidence that is above and that should be addressed. Third is addressing discriminatory laws, policies, practices, which might cut across gender, ethnicity, class, political patronage, and so forth. I think it's in this context and the way forward that the SDGs, and there are traces of it in Malaysian government, and even the way the midterm review of the 11th plan that brought many of the institutional reforms into the heart of governance and development planning, is strengthening national institutions such as the Human Rights Commission, the Anti-Corruption Agency, Parliament, and so forth. In this context, effective, accountable, transparent institutions, not just Parliament, but other institutions. And I think here, 5 sectors need to play a key role. One is the citizens and civil society. I think Lavanya well illustrated the voices from the ground that politicians have to respond to, and the shrinking space and the protection of alternative views and democratic rights is fundamental. Second is the academic role, whether it's Academy of Science in evidence-based or interpretation. It is to provide independent, non-biased, without fear and favor in that context. The role of parliamentarians, the all-party parliamentary group, I would say I've been working with members of parliament across all the political divide now. Seeing them in parliament is different. Seeing them in the constituency is there are different creatures looking at localizing SDG. But parliament is central, and the independence and protection of that. All our plans, even scientific, will fail if politicians don't play the right role. The role of media, independent, free media, so much has been written on this. And finally, a point that I think we need to struggle with is the independence of the civil service. And it's important that the civil service, the argument of political master and civil servant, the independent, irrespective of who is, I think this theme really builds on the theme of the Rukun Negara, federal constitution, loyalty to king and country, as opposed to a politician or political party. So fundamental to all that we are talking of in economic, social, environmental, even partnership, is if we don't bring fundamental freedoms, human rights into it, and the governance structure that is independent, transparent, inclusive, accountable. How do we bell the cat, as it were, in this context, and still maintain academic independence, rigor, and so forth? I think international benchmarking is quite critical. Thank you very much, Tan Sri, and for this opportunity to highlight both peace and people, And I think in people, returning dignity back to the people, I think now, and rights of the people to even unionize and so forth to protect their interests is quite critical in the context of poverty. Alternative models like cooperatives that ILO, social economy are quite critical. Thank you very much for this.
Thank you, Prof. Dato. Thank you very much for those views. Last but not least, I want to give the floor to Ms. Tan Mei Ling, who is currently with the World Bank in Malaysia. She used to work at MDEC. She has a lot of experience in the region. So without further ado, Ms. Tan, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Tan Sri, and thank you very much also to Academy Science Malaysia, Prof. Dr. Asma for the invitation to me and the World Bank to speak on this very important topic. The next slide, please. Being the last speaker, I'm very cognizant to be sexy and on time. And also on the topic of partnerships is also the last SDG 17, which supports all the other 16 SDGs. And the work of the World Bank is really multi-sectorial, multi-stakeholder approach. And we work on all the 4 areas in people, planet, prosperity, and peace. And that's how we can be effective because it's such a complex issue. The World Bank in Malaysia is a knowledge and research hub. Being an upper middle income country, Malaysia is not lending is not borrowing from the bank. And so what we do here is to do research and studies and papers to go into policy making, evidence-based policy making. Next slide, please. So here I would like to localize the SDGs in the areas of people, planet, and prosperity. The World Bank also does a lot of work in peace areas, and we work in fragile conflict states in South Sudan, in South Sudan, and also in many areas. But here, especially in light of climate change and the COVID-19 pandemic, I will focus more on these 3 respective areas. Next slide, please. So in terms of the environment, the bank, this is a new trust fund in ProBlue, and it's a global trust fund that we work in many regions in the world. But in Southeast Asia particularly, we work on marine plastics and marine pollutions. Because that's such a key issue. This ProBlue looks at cleaner and productive oceans and better health for the oceans, but the human being love for plastics has increased exponentially, more than 6,000% since the 1960s. And because human being now is on the convenience and easy culture, it's about single sachets, it's about much more plastic bottles. So the Southeast Asia seas and the seas around us are really polluted with marine plastics, affecting the health, lives and livelihoods and the biodiversity. So we work with all the countries on these platforms on an ASEAN regional scale. Next slide, please. And in Malaysia in particular, we are partnering with CASA, the Ministry of Environment and Water, and there's 4 technical areas as well as capacity buildings and workshops. We are very cognizant that marine plastics is a regional and global issue, and no single country can do it alone. We hope that this studies goes into evidence policy making, and we understand it will go into the 12 Malaysia plan, the circular economy roadmap. But the challenge now is the next step, which is really operationalizing the studies into policy making. The previous slide, please. So in terms of that, it's important for the government of Malaysia to retain its urgency and its resolve that it has come up with the roadmap in 2018 and to maintain its leadership in regional forums in ASEAN and APEC, and to continue that despite of changes in governments and all. So that is important, and bringing into Prof. Denison's point earlier, that the civil service becomes such an important piece in terms of policy making and implementation. Next slide. Besides working with government, we also work very closely with regulators such as Bank Negara, Securities Commission, as well as the private sector. This graph shows, this chart shows the bank, the World Bank. So we have expertise in green financing and green bonds. And working closely with Bank Negara and Securities Commission, Malaysia being a leader, a global leader in Islamic finance, we have created a new asset class, the green sukuk, which becomes a global public good, which will appeal to more market economies. And the red dots here shows where Malaysia, the work from the Malaysia hub is originating from and becomes a public good. The more recent one is the National Green Taxonomy. And it's also a global report coming from the work that we do nationally here. And why this green taxonomy is important? Because it informs the banks, the lending, to say that what's my green lending portfolio? So if I want to increase my lending portfolio now, which is only 5% green loans, how do I get to 50% in the next 5 to 10 years? So the likes of CIMB and Maybank, if they want to have really catalyze the marketplace in the manufacturing, in construction, in the adoption of green technologies. This is important because it encourages the industry to have a greater take up if they really we want to change and shift our economy. Next slide, please. Besides on planet, we also work on prosperity, and that's the economy, and especially in COVID-19, the last 2 years is about the recovery, and the greener recovery is about digitization for jobs, people, and industries, and especially the SMEs. We also collaborate with the academia, with Academy Science Malaysia. We have recently done a report on the region and on Malaysia also, on also back to the earlier point on the ROI on all the R&D spend, and how have we commercialized that? How have we make that the economies of scale to make it much more for public good? We also look into work closely with government, agency, industries. It's because as the global trade value chains is so important that Malaysia companies do not lose out, especially in the last 2 years. And we also work with NGOs, such as here, Think City, because they have local context. The bank can only be effective if we work more and more with NGOs, with academicians and local organizations. In the next final slide on people. And this is a slightly different example, but I thought it would be relevant because it involves technology, innovations, and e-wallets. And this is with the migrant communities, and this work we have done in plantations as well as the migrant communities in Sabah, where especially now in COVID, to have e-remittances and to reduce the cost, and the people, especially where a large number of them are women and they're sending money home for the well-being of their families are key. So I'm also the gender focal point in Malaysia and looking to policy decision-making and mainstreaming gender in all sectors of policy making here. And I would like to leave here with 3 questions. One is that how do we move to an economic model where less is more, where the inputs stays or even reduce towards outputs. So I give you an example in UK, where in 2020, the energy consumption and production is less than in the 1970s. So, and the GDP has tripled from 1970s to 2020, and population has increased. And yet, energy production has decreased. So if we can do that, how can we move to that model where sustainable, the SDG 12 becomes very important? And then secondly, is also how do we really ramp up science and innovation and technology into evidence-based policy making and into government and into the civil service? And third, lastly, are we moving fast enough? And how can we, if not, then how can we do so? Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Tan, for another interesting discussion here. Can you hear me? All right, we have come to the section on discussion with the panel and also then questions from the floor. As chairman, I would take the liberty to conduct this discussion and questions from the floor together. I suppose we would end by 11:45, right, Dr. Ho? So what I would like to do, ladies and gentlemen, eventually, is to come up with some recommendations to President Asma, her council, and the Academy of Sciences. What's the way forward for this dialogue today? I see it as interaction between the knowledge generators or the scientists, and that means the social and the natural scientists, and how we connect to the society at large through political leaders and also decision makers. So the second one, I also want to note that our discussion here is not strictly academic. It's really, we are working for a model that Academy of Science Malaysia can contribute to the current conundrum facing our nation, our society today. But having said that, I think we should be very encouraged by some of the recent developments. In fact, the two that was mentioned by Ms. Lavanya early on, the two court cases. But there are others, you know. So let me open up the floor. I would want the panelists first to respond. Dr. Dennison, you talk about people and also peace. One of the observations from the participants today, in fact, from my very old mentor, Tan Sri Saleh Muhammad Noor, despite more than 60 years of independence, we are still having problem on national unity, racial harmony, you know. So, Dato, can you comment on that? Racial harmony?
Yes,
Yeah.
Tan Sri, thank you. I saw the comment by Tan Sri Saleh in the chat. I think it's an area of a real area of concern, in a sense that we are sort of you know, very paradoxical situation, because if you go to the ground, as I did in my work with parliamentarians to Pasir Mas or to Jeli or to Pendang and so forth, you see the hospitality and compassion of the community at the ground, irrespective of what your race is or your ethnicity or your conversation. I'm very ignorant of Kelantanese women. I didn't know they love gold more than anything else. So very much in line with many Indian women as well. Not trying to stereotype gender here. But having said that, the contestation seems to be at a more political level. And what we then need to address is the politicization of race and ethnicity in the country. There was calls for hate speech, more community mediation and other forms in addressing these concerns. So politicians, I would feel, in many ways have utilized it. They have toppled democratically elected government in this country, but yet with the takeover by one dominant race, they couldn't hold it together, because end of the day, it is for political power and the use. So the area of race and religion, and this is where the majority in our society, whether it's silent majority, the academia and others need to come up to really speak of the true nature of Malaysian society, the shared history, and so forth. So if we stick to the principles of Rukun Negara and federal constitution, it should be okay. But we are really divided at a political end, which is then being exploited, both religion and race, to the detrimental nature of our society. But I can walk to any kampong, any area, and feel I would be well hosted. This is in contrast if you were to walk in New York. When I went to the HLPF in New York, my host told me, please come back before 11. Don't come after midnight because of the area that I was living in. It's unsafe for you as an Indian to walk. You will get mugged. So, Tan Sri, I accept the reality. We need academicians to speak up when things are said wrongly, whether it is gender, whether it is ethnicity, and to hold to a constitutional position that we are all Malaysians, we are all loyal to this country, and that the Rukun Negara is our framework. That is being undermined, Tan Sri. Thank you.
All right, I'm not going to open the Pandora's box.
Okay.
But I'm going to proceed still on politics, but the politics of sustainable development. I want to ask Lavanya. There is a question about natural capital, and you also mentioned about this gross ecological product versus GDP. Recently, about 2 months ago, I think Professor Dasgupta from Cambridge University, the economics of biodiversity loss, he urged about natural...
Dr. Dasgupta.
All right, Dasgupta. Yeah, Lavanya first.
Thank you very much, Tan Sri, and thank you for the question. I think the question probably wants to find out how we can incorporate natural capital into decision making and advance towards making things like the gross ecological ecosystem product the more real and coherent way of measuring progress compared to what we are doing now, which many have commented is deficient. And even in the IPCC, it says that we don't move to a well-being kind of measurement of progress, that small window of opportunity is lost. So what can we do? There have been some advancements in Malaysia already, I believe. So last year, the budget actually was announced to be one that was fully aligned to... sorry, I think there's some interference. Sorry.
Some muting is necessary.
Okay, thank you.
Secretary, Dr. Ho, go ahead, Lavanya.
Thank you. Yeah, so last year's budget was aligned fully. It was announced to the SDGs. We await, and this year there's a new process that's being undertaken where they assure more transparency also in the whole budget planning process as well as the delivery. So it would be good to see how, the assessment of last year's budget towards, meeting SDGs was done. But advancing that, there are tools that can be applied. For example, green budgeting. Now I'm focusing more on the green part, but this kind of concept can be extended to incorporate the very important social aspects, to incorporate social capital needs as well. So green budgeting, for example, has been adopted in some countries like France, where they take into account, all the budget lines and they assess it according to certain criteria in terms of your environmental well-being, whether it's mitigation, adaptation, whether it's pollution, and so on. And from there, they can assess what are aligned to the SDGs on environment, what are somewhat aligned, and those areas which are contradictory, okay, to the alignment on a green budgeting process. So that gives you a big picture. Now, but how do you do that instead? I mean, what kind of tools can be employed to actually assess, are we making trade-offs to the environment? One, of course, is, just looking at it and assessing, what are the trade-offs. For example, with the Kuala Langat example we talked about, or the Penang example, already you can see the communities, their voices, and scientifically also how much carbon emissions would have been released if that peat swamp was destroyed. These are already information that should be taken into account strongly in making such decisions. But in addition to that, like the tool that science has developed now called the INVEST, it's a software actually, which stands for Integrated Valuation of Ecosystem Services and Trade-offs. This has been developed by something called the Natural Capital Project, housed by Stanford University and many other universities. And it can help guide policymakers in pinpointing where and for whom conservation efforts can have the greatest payoff. So this is a tool that's been developed using science to help make those decisions. And so China was actually committing to this whole vision of an ecological society, but they didn't have science to basically calculate the returns on the investment to protect and restore the most critical natural capital. So with this tool, they were able to do that. So it's already been successfully employed. So so I think there are definitely tools now available. It's just up to us as a nation to adopt these approaches and shift to a more holistic framework of decision making to incorporate natural capital. Thank you.
Thank you, Lavanya. Raja, I know you want to comment on Pata Dasgupta. I also have another question for you on R&D and our Malaysian situation. Can you comment on Dasgupta first? Raja? You're on mute. Raja, you're on mute. All right, Raja.
Gupta, of course, has come on strong, just like Nicholas Stern and William Douglas, working on the environment at the global stage. And he was an academic when I did my PhD there, where he taught in Cambridge. I'm sure your focus will be on R&D, and that's not what Gupta specialized on. Yes.
Okay, comment on R&D.
I think the Malaysian situation is, we've been doing, as I've mentioned earlier, we've been spending extensively, especially so when you were in charge as in the National Science Council. You played an important role to raise the GERD in GDP, gross expenditure in R&D in GDP. In fact, it went up to something like 1.5, incredibly from about 0.8. Those are inevitable investments, but how much of it was translated? And now the UN measures innovation output in different ways. One is the immediate output, which is patents, trademarks, copyright, things like that, industrial designs, industrial layouts, and so on and so forth. Then, of course, how much of it is commercialized? Now, I mean, I've done some work for the World Bank, but I normally work with those in Washington. Now, in that sort of sense, I think the last two parts are quite minimal, and I often contribute to the UNESCO science reports. The last one is the 2021 report where I wrote the Southeast Asian chapter, including Singapore. Now, we don't really perform well there. Now, countries that have succeeded have had very successful mechanisms to ensure that those who are not performing are removed. Of course, on the one hand, you can take the quadruple helix framework of Sweden, which a lot of them have discussed, Erkowitz and others, and emphasize that a lot of these innovations are going to civil society requirements in mitigating climate change, in addressing problems of the poor. Indeed, they do that. That's why we see there is a diversification of how R&D funds are spent in the Nordic countries. Now, on the other side of it, even if we don't emphasize so much there because we haven't got there yet, look at how Korea, Taiwan, and originally Japan did it. They are quite careful examples to look at. The cat can look at the king. And where they didn't perform, Park Chung-hee was aggressive, not just that he was a dictator. When a particular grant was given or a subsidized a grant was given, I mean, a loan was given, this is from the heavy and chemical industry program of 1975, non-performers were removed. And if money was sent, abused, they were sent to jail, including his own uncle was sent to jail. Now, we don't have any of those rigorous measures to see that those who are dissipating this, effectively they are rents because they are subsidies of some kind, implicit subsidies. Now, what actually that means is that they prevented a system of supporting innovation, of supporting an uncertain, risky activity, but removing them quickly if they are not performing, because you can still fail if you don't have proper, even if you don't have proper evaluation. That actually means that we should go back to this foresight thing that ASM did and use it more extensively, more rigorously to see that that system is workable. I think at the moment, it's not really seriously workable. That's what I would have to say on that front, Tan Sri.
All right, thank you, Raja.
And just one more point.
All right.
Who wrote the little blurb down there? I've done work on this in Chile, Brazil, Argentina, Mexico, some African countries, and so on. Also the Central African countries, not just a few countries they put there.
No, we know. You have done a marvelous job on those developing countries. I have some questions for Ms. Tan, but I want to wait on that for now. I want to go back to the ambience we are trying to create here. What we are trying to create is to move into a transformation, a change which is really now taking place in our beloved country. I want to touch on the point about the involvement of the politician, the elephant in the room. Someone from the chat said, let's forget about the politician. They are inconsequential. But I say they are the most important thing here. Love them or hate them, they are here to stay. The thing is, how do we frame the situation? We have on one side the knowledge generators, as I said, the scientists from the Academy of Sciences and others, NGOs like the WWF, how we interact with the political masters. We saw those issues, the Penang issue and the Kuala Langat North. Those are the voice of the people in a strong democratic voice, which somehow changed the way the politicians react, and they have changed. And that's a very good sign. And a few days ago, also we had another good news about letting young people, U18, to be involved in the voting process. So there are some very good high notes recently. My question to all the panelists is, how do we promote that? I know in Parliament, Dr. Dennison, you have the all-party parliamentary group. I would suggest if you can look at how Academy of Science can spearhead a mechanism. I was recently involved with some friends internationally to launch this so-called International Network for Government Science Advice, INGSA. I think Dr. Awang knows about this through the ISC, INGSA. Increasingly, this platform is crucial to moderate and to educate the political masters. Can we have some views on this from any of the
Thank you, Tan Sri. Just to mention about the all-party parliamentary group system, when Parliament undertook in 2018 parliamentary reform, the Speaker then introduced the all-party parliamentary group contacts system, which is a model developed in the UK Parliament. He contrasted that with parliamentary select committees, which are largely members of parliament. And so in the APPGM system, anyone can actually initiate to set up. There is a form, there is the guidelines, the procedure. It meant that it's a multi-stakeholder group where academicians, where civil society, think tanks, private sector could actually initiate. There are 3 parliamentary APPG groups. SDG was the first. and I think the I think well coordinated. You have detention centers, and then you also have on refugees. It's initiated by a secretariat and the forms and so forth. It's an engagement process with parliamentarians. It is important for us to understand the kind of political contestation that takes place. But in the SDG context, the parliamentarians were open and sympathetic because we move it to the constituency level to do local mapping of issues, situational analysis, solution projects. We secured 120,000 for each member of parliament in the group for SDG solutions. It could be income generation, it's on plastic waste, it's 40, 50,000 for a project. And here we have academicians, civil society, content experts involved in the process. So you cannot discount politicians, Tan Sri. The whole country is run and dominated by the political power. Academicians cannot turn left or right without bumping into a politician or what, unless Prof. Rasia and others who do more international work and publication are at a different ground. Just 2 points here, Tan Sri. I think it's important for us to hold politicians accountable, and that is possible from the voter base on the ground. Politicians respond to public opinion, Twitter, Facebook, popularity. It's moving the people. And I think some of the environmental changes that took place addresses that. It becomes more, and the other one, Tan Sri, just very briefly, is the strengthening of the civil service. I think Tun Ahmad, the late Tun Ahmad Sarji's book, his own memoirs bring the role of the district officer. I think we need to move into that, relook at that in the context of political capture. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Ms. Tan.
Many jump after that, Prof. Denison.
Very quickly, 1 minute.
Many? Sorry,
Raja.
Oh.
Raja. Raja, you have the floor for 1 minute.
Sure. On what is this, Prof. Zakri?
You wanted the floor, no?
No, I was just reacting to Denison's point that what is if the politicians end up jumping? Even there are some civil society members who also jump.
Oh, okay.
It's all right, it's okay, yeah.
Okay, I understand. But I think we are talking about the institutions. You cannot avoid politicians, but holding them accountable through the active, well-informed citizenry. And I think distinguished professors and Academy of Science plays a major role, whether public advocacy or advisory in that context. Thank you.
Well, that's what you think, Dato, but really it's not. That's how we want to empower Academy of Science and academics. I have a question for Ms. Tan. I'm very impressed with your presentation and the need for a multi-sectoral and a multi-stakeholder approach. I wanted to ask you, because there's some questions from the floor also, and this relates to the civil service. Malaysia seems to lose ground on leading some of the debate internationally. You know, a few months ago, when a strong and big country invited a select group of countries for a meeting on climate change, we were not invited. And one politician said we were not invited. Maybe climate change is not so crucial to Malaysia, which is not true. But I think this one question from Professor Ahmad Ibrahim in the audience, you know, and also I think Dato' Rahim ni, somehow Malaysia is not as high profile as before. Comment, Ms. Tan, from the World Bank.
Thank you so much, Tan Sri, for the question, and very pertinent one. And also, let me take a step back on your question earlier on the importance of politicians and ministers and leadership. That is very important. We can't do away without. I've been in government, and now I'm in the World Bank. And I realized that many times it's also the leadership that's so important. We need a strong and independent civil service, and we also need a cabinet becomes very important. We can see this in the Kuala Langat case. So in terms of international fora, the leadership, the ministers, as well as the civil service is very important. So in the last 2 years, globally, not just Malaysia, COVID-19 has taken over. And because of the change of government that we have had, that also coincided at the same time with COVID-19, that has taken first and foremost the attention away from climate change. That's my point of view. And that's why it doesn't percolate to the top, the headlines in the newspapers and what we see. But definitely climate change is so important. In the last 2 years, working with the government from the bank and working with government, we see climate change as an important issue, but it doesn't get the limelight. And with this new government, with this new cabinet, they still need to maintain that resolve. And it's such a multi-sectoral issue, and it's very in silos. We need inter-ministries from KETSA, CASA. We need the Prime Minister to champion this. And when we go to COP26, we need to make some bold statements. And we have to say that. And if we are not invited in the last few months, maybe because we have been silent, Malaysia has been silent in the last couple of years. So it's really putting that out, and to have that strong civil service voice, the KSUs, the deputy secgens and all, we do have MOF. There are some silver lining. We have MOF minister, we have some MOF counterparts, and we have some gems in civil service still. We have you, we have Academy Science Malaysia, we have people in the room. We have shown Kuala Langat what civil society and public advocacy can do, and we have to ramp it up. And that's how we can get to net zero. We can have that policy statement, but we need a concerted and sustained effort.
Thank you, Ms. Tan, for your eloquence. So we have come to the end of our meeting. Who wants the floor? Lavanya,
yeah,
2 minutes, 1 minute.
1 minute, thank you.
Yeah.
I just wanted to add to what Mei Ling just said. I think we have some very powerful people who have been champions for Malaysia in the past in these international negotiations. For example, during the Paris Agreement negotiations, we had Prof. Gurdial Singh and also Dr. Gary Tessera. But even before yourself, Tan Sri, with the CBD Rio negotiations at that time, Mr. Chow Kok Ki, we have people. It's just that, I don't know, for whatever reason, we are not advancing them into key positions in the negotiations. And this should be done. I mean, we have to use our talents and get Malaysia back on the stage. We have played a key role in the past. We can still. We have so much to offer. We have so much to offer in terms of a mega diverse country as well, that kind of information and input. But we are not taking strong action. I think I saw Dato' Rahim Nik asking also, why are we not setting a net zero target? What is our concern? There's some reluctance, but we are hoping that, okay, maybe studies, and that's why science needs to come in and fill in the gap to convince that, look, this is a no-brainer, we need to do it. So I'll stop there.
All right, we have run out of time. Ladies and gentlemen, while you were discussing and listening, I make some notes, in particular for the consideration of President Asma. Can we roll down my last slide, Dr. Ho? Dr. Ho, the last slide. Okay, can you besarkan? Ladies and gentlemen, I think these are some of the salient points that we need to consider moving forward. I think the 5 Ps that we have been discussing this morning is a good basis for future actions. I think the second bullet, scientists, that means natural and social scientists, need to package their messages to be understood by the public. So this forum today is fine among the ASM. I think we need to do more to publicize ourselves. Third, I think scientists need to interact with political leaders and policy makers, very important. And also the political leaders and policy makers needs to reach out to the scientific community. We are here to help actually. So finally, I think ASM could be the honest broker to link the scientists and the political leaders. I seek some comments from the president, and if it's not, if we think it's a good idea, I think we can work on it. Maybe from Asma, some observation, concluding remarks from you.
Right. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Thank you very much, Tan Sri Zakri, and to all the esteemed panelists, and also to the fellows for your insightful comments regarding what is going on with a very important topic today. Can you maintain, Tan Sri Zakri, in your slide, the last slide to go forward, please? Basically, I hear what everybody is saying regarding this topic, and I think this topic is a very important one for us to go forward. And I was discussing tadi to actually put this topic up under STPAC to see whether the formation of a task force to address the issues, especially the how. I mean, we know about the what's, as Professor Ahmad Ibrahim was saying, we know a lot about the what's. The question is the how to move forward. Mungkin that one need to be addressed and in a concise manner. But the way forward, I think is also about engagement. You know, when we are making, as I said in my speech today, one thing is about scientific evidence. And when you want to provide the advice, I think this is where you need mega engagement with the quadruple helix, including the politicians, so that they understand, and that before we make the advice, there is a need for them to also understand the scientific issues, to understand the issues behind that particular problem, so that now when they make the decision or the political policies, then they will be in a more understanding mode. And in order to do that and to educate the civil society is also important, as you say, for us to reach out, and reach out not in terms of technical papers, but mainly also to make it more palatable, easier. I mean, we have a lot of media, Fascinate, we have our own fact sheets and whatnot, but I think you are right, we need to do more of this kind of easy understanding engagement, so that people are much more aware. I take the point about being an honest broker, but I prefer to call it a trusted entity. So far, Tan Sri Academy has been a trusted entity with the quadruple helix, because when we call for engagement with the quadruple helix, including civil society, we take note about what are their comments before we then come back together to create a policy. And then once we create some scientific advice towards making the policy, we go back to the quadruple helix and ask them again for more comments. So this is how I think we do this kind of engagement, and the fact that APPGM is there, that will also be another way, Prof. Denison, to actually allow us the ability to engage better.
Prof, I would suggest you all set up a separate APPGM on scientific.
We did. That
I can help that. I can help.
Okay. We asked for it. It was okay before, and then at last minute they decide to remove it. So if necessary, we will do it again. to make sure that we have our own for STI, because I think science now is cross cutting and we need to have all this being addressed. So I would greatly appreciate your help to be able to set up what we had proposed before for a separate one for STI. So with that, thank you very much to all the panelists. We will bring this up to STIPEC to see how is the way forward. And thank you very much, Tan Sri, and all the panelists for all the ideas that you have put forward. The whole thing is being recorded, and we will then have the analysts put together to bring it to STIPEC as to what's to do next, especially with the suggestions of way forward from Tan Sri Zakri. So thank you very much to Tan Sri and all the esteemed panelists.
Thank you, President. We have run out of time. Thank you so much. I hope we can do more of this kind of dialogue among different stakeholders. Stay safe. Enjoy the weekend.
Thank you very much.
Right, thank you. Stay safe.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much.
Bye,
Thank you.
Tan Sri.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Prof. Asma. Thank
Thank you, Tan Sri Zakri, for moderating the session just now. I hope everyone was enlightened by our specialists through their informative and eye-opening presentations. Ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the end of today's program. I would like to thank our distinguished guests once again for the insightful session today. A big appreciation goes to you, our viewers, as well, for joining us today. Stay up to date on other quality programs organized by the Academy of Sciences Malaysia via our Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. And don't forget to mark your calendar on 7 October 2021 for the launching of Science Outlook 2021. Science Outlook 2020. Stay safe and have a pleasant day.